when we talk about living a life on mission, when we talk about going and preaching the good news, we aren't trying to convince people to worship. They already worship. The world is very religious. They just worship weak, fragile things. Little bronze statues, little rectangular metal things. Name it. We worship success. We worship all sorts of things. And we're wrapped into this. And so what he's saying here is like, our job is not trying to convince people. And in fact, the Athenians were like, Brandon, maybe this is another God that we haven't heard of. We'd love something else. Why? Why weren't the Athenians like offended by this at first? Because they're like, there's something else that'll make my life better? Sure. Add it to the pile. Maybe this is a button I can push on those really bad days. Maybe your God's like super powerful. It'd be great. I'd love to have that. And that's what our world sees of this. And maybe this is what you see of this at times. What is the church for? Is it just like, man, this is the button I push when things get really rough. I got to go to church. You see, there's a problem here. There's a problem with our worship. And our job is not to convince the world to worship. It's to direct their worship to the one true God. And so this is what he says. He starts to go to them and he starts to preach to them. And we hear this idolatry, don't we, in our lives? We hear it in the conversations that we have. We can see the idolatry on our calendars. It's all over. It's not an us versus them or anything like that. It's that we ought to feel just as provoked as Paul does by our own idolatry and the idolatry of the world outside. And we go, I don't want this idolatry in my life. And they need to hear the good news of Jesus Christ, because what do I do with my idolatry? What do you guys do with your idolatry? Hopefully you confess it and you repent and you turn from it, right? And you're like, God, I don't want to worship that. I don't want to worship that. And he forgives you and you move on, right? And maybe you still struggle with it, but you have peace knowing that Christ has forgiven you and that you can live a life free of that pursuing God. But the world doesn't know that. The world doesn't have that. They see this as just another button to push. A little bit of religion is good. If it betters my life, if my kids will grow up moral, if I can keep them busy and out of bad places, they'll go to more church events. There's no difference. It's just more idolatry.